Okay, thank you everyone for coming on this snowy day. I think I mentioned this in the last year where the Gemara in Brachas talks about who was it? I'm sorry, Ben Yada. One of his greatness was the fact that he came and he learned the entire Sifri on a cold, wintry day, and a snowy day. So hopefully we'll be following in his footsteps. Okay, so today we're going to discuss the halachos, the minhagim, the parameters of yarmulke. So yarmulke is one of the things that we just take for granted, but like everything, when you start to look into it, so there's obviously a whole lot more to it. There's a lot of literature that's written on it. Just one funny story that I grew up with. So my mother always tells me about her father. Her father had a good friend who was a brilliant person. He was a ger chassid. So I don't know if any of you know how a ger chassid looks like, but they have a very unique garb. And what's unique about them is, while most chassidim have their payas that come down to the side, ger chassidim, they put their, they have their payas, they put it under the yarmulke, and then they kind of put the yarmulke on top. So he was a brilliant fellow, and he became a lawyer, and he was interviewing for a law firm. And the law firm quickly realized he's brilliant, so obviously wanted him on their team. But this is, I don't know what year it was, but back then when it wasn't as accepted, and they said, just one thing, if you don't mind, just the yarmulke it's not going to work. I mean, if you don't mind, just take off the yarmulke when you work here. Oh, not a problem. He takes off his yarmulke, and his payas go flowing down. They say, put it back. So we're going to discuss when exactly it would be permitted, for the sake of work. Hopefully, it's not as relevant anymore. Okay, so there's a couple places to begin, but I think I want just to bring out the point that what we take for granted, seemingly wasn't as simple back then, is the Gemara in Shabbos. The Gemara says, and the Gemara in Shabbos is discussing a list of things that Amoram said, Tasili, I deserve reward for having done this. Right? So the Gemara lists many different things. One is he never called his friend nicknames. He would. One is tasily, that he always ate shal shudas, which would indicate, all these things seem to indicate that they're not a clear-cut obligation, right? Because a person saying, I deserve extra reward for having done this, implies that, not everyone did it. So one of them is, Amar Ravuna B'rei Rabbi Yeshua. Ravuna said in the name of Yeshua, tasily l'sagina arba amos b'gilu harosh. I deserve reward because I never walked 4 amos with his head uncovered. So what does this clearly imply? This implies that it wasn't a strict obligation, because, and not only was it not a strict obligation, but it also implies that not everyone was doing this, because, otherwise, I wouldn't say, Tasili, that I wore tefillin today, everyone wears tefillin. But if he's saying that Tasili, I did a reward because I didn't go with Dal and Amos without a yarmulke, implies that not everyone was doing it. Likewise, there's a Gemara in Kedushin Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph. I'm sorry, it's the same Gemara. Quoting that Gemara, Ravuna B'rei Rabbi Yeshua, Lo maski arba amos b'gila rosh, Amar Shechina l'mayla merushi. So Ravuna B'rei Rabbi Yeshua would not go 4 amos with his head uncovered, and he said, why? Shechina l'mayla roshi. He recognized that the Shechina, Hashem's presence, was above his head. So to wear the yarmulke, he wore this head covering. I'm calling it yarmulke. He wore a head covering to recognize the fact that Hashem is always above him. Similarly, there's a Gemara in the Dharma Lamed Amud Beis, which is discussing if a person makes a vow that he's not going to get any benefit from somebody, from Shchorei Harosh, from dark heads. So the Gemara says that he is forbidden in he's forbidden in men. He's not a certain type of men, but nashim katanim are permitted. She'ein ikram shchorei rosh el anashim. Right, this shchorei rosh, dark-headed people, only first to men. The Gemara says, "My time anashim zimna demichsu rishayu v'zimna demigal rishayu." Men, sometimes they cover their head, sometimes they don't cover their head. Al nashim la'ola michsu v'katona la'ola migdal. Right. So nashim, women always cover their hair, right? Because we know the women are obligated to cover their hair, and katonim are always revealed. But in any case, we see that it wasn't that the men sometimes they cover their hair, sometimes they didn't. So you have another source that it wasn't always that men didn't always cover their hair. Similarly, the Gemara in Shabbos is a fascinating Gemara in Shabbos, which says, so the Gemara is talking about whether in Mazel Yisrael, whether Jews are under Mazel. So the Gemara says, nami ein Mazel Yisrael. We see that there's no Mazel Yisrael. The Eimah Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amri la Kaldai Baruch Ganva Hava. So they told Baruch Ganva Hava. He said, your son. So the stargazers, the astrologers, told her that your son is destined to become a ganav, a thief. So what did she do? Lo shavkata guli reshe. She never allowed him to go with his head uncovered. Amrlei Kasi reishcha ki have lach emsa d'shmaya. So always cover your head, so that you'll always have the fear of heaven upon you. Ubay rachma d'lev yada. And then the Gemara says, "Yom echad Yosef kagaris." So one time he was learning, and something fell, and his head covering fell over his head. What happened? His head covering fell off, and right then and there he got such a strong desire to steal, and he went ahead and stole, and he ate these tamarim from the dekel. Now some say that he was actually a katan at this time, right? It was before he was matured, but in any case you see that it was effective, right? As long as he was wearing the yarmulke, so it put the fear of God in him. But the second that it came off, so the stargazer's astrology had proven correct that he did have this capacity of to steal, and that's why his mother did it. But in any case, we see.
I wish it would work today.
We'll see. So in any case, we see that it's a segula for Yerushalayim, but it doesn't seem like it's a clear-cut obligation. Okay, so if you look in the Torah is
interesting by the Kohanim also, because there was a bit that the Yerushalayim also, they have the mitznefes and so on and so forth. That was a very big thing part of their avodah.
Right.
Where they have the source of the
right. So the Torah in Siman Beis is talking about Hanhagas Adam B'Boker, how a person should act in the morning. So he says v'yakum v'yelech b'kfikras koma, and we'll get back to the second. A person should walk not standing up straight, but a little bent over. Kedisa b'parakam kedushin, as the Gemara kedushin says, Amar Yeshua ben Levi aser leilech b'kamas kufa. So the Gemara says quite clearly that it's forbidden to walk upright. Shenemer malei kol aretz kavodo, that Hashem's kavod, Hashem's honor fills the world. And if a person who walks, all tall and strong, so it's as if he's chas v'shalom, pushing away Hashem's kavod. That's why a person has to, when he walks, he shouldn't walk like that. And then continues the Torah, v'yichasa rosho, and one should also cover their head. K'de'isa nami hasam rafuna lo azal arba amas begila rosh amar shchil l'mal roshi. So a person should cover the head, and he quotes this Gemara, which that Rav Huna wouldn't walk more than 4 amos. Now it's interesting. He doesn't say, as he says, that it's usher, right? Like if he starts off by saying it's usher to walk, all stiff and strong, and then he says that person should cover their head. And the Bach picks up on this. But he says, and he discusses whether or not we're going to get back to this, whether or not there's a difference between more than 4 amos, less than 4 amos. But the Bach says, there's actually no prohibition to walk with Gila Rosh. So like we said, it says Rav Huna was the one who was careful in this, which implies the others weren't careful. So the Bach says that there's actually not a prohibition. Covering your head is not a clear-cut halacha that one is obligated in, but it's worthy to do. But if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, and the Shulchan Aruch says in Siman Beis Sifav, the Shulchan Aruch says quite clearly, Lo yelech arba amos begila rosh. So the Shulchan Aruch paskins that it's lo yelech, which means it's forbidden to walk 4 amos with a person if a person's head is uncovered. And adds the Magen Avraham, umidas chasidus afilu pachis v'dal ames. So midas chasidus, if one wants to act piously, then even less than 4 amos, he should be careful not to have his head uncovered. So again, so even though the Torah would seem to indicate that it's not a absolute obligation, there's no chiyuv, but the Shulchan Aruch seems to say that to walk 4 amos is forbidden, and the Magen Avraham says that it's midas chasidus to ensure that one's head is covered even with less than 4 amos.
How did they get from point A to point B though? From that standpoint, how did the Hanhaga Torah become an Isser Gomer? The Shulchan Aruch. How did it make that transition?
That's a good question. So the Beis Yosef seems to learn that he learns the Gemara a little differently, and he seems to learn that it's actual chiyuv obligation.
Right, I understand, but it's interesting.
How did that develop?
Yeah, how did that develop? It's interesting.
Yeah.
You had some Rishonim with the Erev Yavor, another Rishonim was like that.
Right. So we're going to see in just a minute. Different Rishonim had different views on how we understand this chiyuv. Sorry, just. Yeah, okay, maybe we'll get back to that. The Arbor Rishonim, for like the Rush, is the one who says that it's aser. Right. But yeah, the Beis Yosef does seem to understand that. That's why in Shulchan Aruch he says quite clearly that it's aser. Okay.
Does
Does it matter if it's a yarmulke or if it's like a hat? Just your head is covered.
So, well, that's a good question. So, strictly speaking, yes, but and we're going to see there might even be an advantage to a hat over a yarmulke. Why would that be? So, Shlomo Kluger, maybe we'll do that right now. So, Shlomo Kluger, in one of his many svarim, Ha'elef L'cha Shlomo, he is mechadish. He introduces that there's actually a size for a yarmulke. He says that in order to be a yarmulke that allows one to go more than 4 amos, it has to cover most of one's head. Okay, so it has to cover most of one's head, and therefore, a person should have a yarmulke that covers most of one's head. So a hat would certainly seem to do that. However, he says for less than 4 amos, you could have a smaller yarmulke. So again, so if a person just wants to sit around on his bed, then he would be permitted to have a smaller yarmulke. But according to Shlomo Kluger, he would have to have a yarmulke that covers most of his head.
Where does he get that from?
What?
Where does he get most of it?
Where does he get that from? Okay, so let's see. There's a difference between uncovering one's entire head to only partially. That which is implied that less than 4 amos is mutter, right? But the Gemara says that you're not to go 4 amos, which implies you're allowed to go less than 4. He seems to say that misvara logically. He sees him logically. Yeah, and so Rav Moshe actually, in the very first Tshuva in Rav Moshe, if you look in Eger's Moshe, Orach Chaim, Chelik Aleph, Siman Aleph, he discusses this from Shlomo Kluger. And although he calls it Tmuim B'yoser, he calls it very puzzling to say such a thing, he does sort of fit it into, we're going to see in a minute, the Taz. The Taz has throws a different angle into this whole topic, and we'll see in a minute. But Rav Moshe sort of is Mekayim this Shlomo Kluger. He does, somewhat go with it. Okay. Now, moving on. So the Shar Tshuva brings down from the Bechor Shar, the Bechor Shar on this Gemara in Shabbos that we just mentioned, that he said, Teisi li, I deserve reward for not going more than 4 amos. He says, Lav daf kalich ala fila ba'amida v'yeshiva tzarech lizar. That even one standing, even one sitting, meaning not just if one's walking less than 2 amos, but even if one just sitting or standing, a person should make sure to wear a yarmulke. And the Mishnah Berurah brings down that filo of ace hashena belayla, it brings from the Shla. So this is the source for the shluf couple. Right? There's yarmulkes that stay on when you go to sleep. So the Mishnah Berurah brings from the Shla that there is an idea to have one's head covered, even when one's sleeping. Okay. So now we're going to move on to the Taz. And the Taz, who's one of the other Nosek Kelim on the Shulchan Aruch, says something fascinating. He says, there's an entirely different reason why it's forbidden to go without, if one's head is uncovered. So now it became the chok. When did we discuss? I think for Thanksgiving. We discussed the concept of that we're not allowed to go in the ways of the non-Jews. So it says the Taz that since nowadays, he's speaking in his times, is the norm for non-Jews that as soon as they sit down, they take off their hat. So since this became the minhag, the custom of non-Jews, to immediately take off their hat as soon as they sit down, so now this is one of their ways, and therefore it's forbidden to do that. And certainly in this case, he says, not only is it a negative, but there's a positive reason to wear head covering because it brings your Shemaim, as we saw.
In court, by the way, that's still the rule today.
Yeah?
It's still the rule because I was wearing a hat in court, and my lawyers should take it off. I was happy to sit with my yarmulke, of course, but it's interesting. No, you have to remove your hat.
Right. And I think by a ball game, you also take off your hat. No, that's like the accepted norm to take it off by a ball game.
I'm wearing yarmulke. No, I had my hat. I was wearing
what? For national anthem, yeah. Take it off for national anthem also, right?
What?
Take it off for the national anthem also.
Right.
So
the yarmulke is not a problem. It's interesting.
Right.
Courts regulate. You can sit with the yarmulke, but you have to remove it.
I know when I had jury duty a couple years ago, I wanted to keep on someone right to the court. Nobody said a word.
That's good. Okay, so the Gemara says, so the Taz says that, and the quotes the Gemara, there's another Gemara Kedusha which we didn't mention yet. How Gavdal Michsi ratio, there's a certain man who wasn't covering his head. Amr Kamar Chatzavai Gavra. Look how chutzpahdik this person is. Okay, Vadi yarchik asma zeh yosem misharchu seh. And the Taz says that a person should be distance himself even in this regard, in this minhag, in this accepted practice, even more than other laws of the non-Jews. So the Taz introduces, right? We haven't had this yet. Until now, we're just discussing, is it Yerushalayim, or is there an Isser to walk? And now the Taz says there's a whole other reason, because it came b'chukosem l'sulechu, since it became the way of the non-Jews. So the Moshe in Igros Moshe. Chelik Dalid, Simon Dalid, I believe. Simon Beis. He discusses, let's say a person needs to get a job, and the only way he'll be able to get the job is if it doesn't wear the yarmulke. See, where should we get? He needs to have his interview. He's got to take off his yarmulke, because if he wears the yarmulke, they won't accept him for work. And not only that, there was a person who was interceding on his behalf, who was putting in a good word, and the guy said, "It's going to look really bad on me if you don't look good." So he says that, but don't worry. After you get the job, they'll let you sit there with the yarmulke. So Rav Moshe brings down this task. He says that the Isser Abachukoseim. So he says really, and then Rosh agrees with it in essence. He says that the Taz is saying correct. However, there is what to rely on, meaning to not follow the Taz, not follow the Taz. Meaning, if it's an Isser B'chukoseyim, there's nothing to talk about, right? A person's obligated to lose all their money to avoid transgressing a lav, a prohibition. However, he said, "Behefsa gadol, one can rely on the opposing opinions, and there are opposing opinions. Right nowadays, it's very clearly that people don't. You ask a non-Jew, why are you not wearing a yarmulke? They'll say, I'm doing it because of my custom. Of course not. They say, why are you wearing a yarmulke? Right? It's not very comfortable. This is easier for them to do. Right? Nobody wears hats anymore. Who was the first president who stopped wearing the hat? That was Kennedy. Right? It was a big deal.
He took off his top hat.
Yeah. So. Right, even if it's cold outside, as soon as they come inside, they take off their hats. So then there's no reason, they're not obligated to wear, so they just don't, they will go without covering it. Right? It's ridiculous that Moshe that nowadays to say that people are doing it for this chok reason. So that therefore the Taz Svar no longer applies. So he said it's only a zihirus mitzad minhag hatov, and therefore, in a case of hefsin mamon, a person would not have to rely on it. A person would not have to be machmer, to be stringent in this regard. Now, actually, in that first Tshuva Rav Moshe, which I mentioned, the very first Tshuva in Igros Moshe, Rav Moshe addresses a different thing, and that is: do we say there's a concept that if the entire Jewish people accept something upon themselves, so maybe it becomes like a neder, right? It becomes a vow that the entire Jewish people took upon themselves, and therefore one would be obligated in this vow, right? Meaning, it could be, you're right, all along it wasn't a strict obligation, but once something happens and the entire Jewish people accepts upon themselves, then it becomes like a neder, and you're in essence violating a neder. So, for example, the Aruch HaShulchan writes very strongly when it comes to the custom of not eating meat during the 9 days, right? And there's a difference between Sfardim and Ashkenazim. Sfardim are only machmir, are only strict not to eat shvu shechalbo, and the Ashkenazim are machmir already from Rosh Chodesh. But if you look in the Mishnah and Tainus, the Mishnah and Tainus clearly says that it was only forbidden on the day of. Right? No, not just. Only Erev Tisha B'Av. I'm sorry, remind me again. Is it Shvush Chalbo?
Should be Shvush Chalbo. But whatever, it's a major nafkamina.
Right, but doesn't the Mishnah talk about only. It's the end of Tainus over there. The Gemara. Okay, so I'm sorry. Yes, so Shvush Chalbo. So, but we're machmer already from Rosh Chodesh. So some people were trying to be lenient. And we're in his machmir, and the Aruch HaShulchan tries chai v'kayim. He says chas v'shalom. He says this is something that the entire Jewish people accepted upon themselves. So even if you want to say that you could point to the Gemara or the Mishnah that says that it's not usher, but once the entire Jewish people accepted something upon themselves, it becomes a neder.
Minig Yisrael Torah. Minig
Yisrael Torah, right? But he says it has a status of a neder, and therefore perhaps one could argue that in this case you would say the same thing. But Rav Moshe says no, that's not true, and he says because. Yes, we accepted it, but over here we only accept it as a chumrah. Right? We accept it as a stringency. So our very acceptance from the get-go was only as a stringency and not as a clear isser. So you have to know when.
On which one, yarmulke?
On yarmulkes, yeah, when it comes to yarmulkes, and therefore Moshe says behefsen mama when it comes to financial loss, a person not being able to take a job. That's a ein lecha hefsen mama gedol mizu. That certainly one would be lenient that and not have to wear his yarmulke. Again, that case was talking about a case where supposedly he was going to be able to wear the yarmulke as soon as he gets the job, but technically Rav Moshe does say that for parnasa one would be allowed to go without a yarmulke.
That was a meaning in Germany, a very strong meaning, but amongst the Talmudim for Hirsch, that the Jews became professionals.
Right.
That he was mocked them to go for the interviews and to work
Yeah.
as doctors, lawyers, or
Yeah.
government officers without a
Baruch Hashem, nowadays it's not as necessary, but okay. So then there's a Trumas Adeshin who says that. So now we're going to move on to what about for Torah and Tefillah? All right. So until now we're just talking about in general walking around, but what about when it comes to davening and when it comes to Tefillah? Oh, so when I mentioned that I'm going to tie it into the storm, because my Eli Melech this morning when he told me that he walked here with his boots, that he said he wasn't sure was he allowed to walk into the shul with his boots because he thought maybe it wasn't respectful for davening. So. So we're going to see that there's many halachas, specifically for covered for tefillah, and included in this is covering one's head. So the Trumas Adeshin, who starts with the shaila, as we all know, the Trumas Adeshin shailas, most shailas and truvas are actual shailas that were sent to a rav, and he responded with an actual answer. The Trumas Adeshin shailas were made up shailas, meaning he wrote them as he went, and just thought of a good shaila. He said, "This is the shaila, and this is the response." So. He starts off asking, what about if you have a woven, you have some type of woven yarmulke, and it's like I guess that's not such a thick weave. It's like a more of a thin, looser weave.
So it's a lot of holes and gaps.
A lot of holes and gaps. So he says that's not a problem, but he says that when it comes to Torah and Tefillah, one must certainly be machmir, and there's an isser to daven and to learn the Gila Rosh. But he wonders, would it be permitted? What about this? Does this count? Right? If I wasn't wearing my yarmulke right now and I put my head over my hand over my head, would that count as kisei rosh or not? So he wants to bring a raya from Rabbi Teitelbaum. So it says that Rabbi Teitelbaum, when he was let's say he was taking a bath in the bathhouse, so what he would do is he would take a beged, right? Because there's a halach that you can't make a bracha when your libo rose erva. My heart could see directly the makam erva. So what he would do is he would take a beged, he would take a clothing, put it over his heart, and then you make the bracha. So what do we see from here? We see that the hand wouldn't work. I'm sorry?
It's attached to the body.
Right, so he said the hand wouldn't work.
It's still an independent source of
right. But then the Trumas Adeshin says perhaps it's different. Perhaps when it comes to, for this it would work. Yes, part one guf. So, okay, and in any case, so he wants to say that for Torah and Tefillah, one would certainly have to be machmir, and he wonders whether or not using one's hand would work. So then we come to the Marshal. So, just a brief introduction. The Marshal, there's some gedolim that their personality really comes through their writings. Right? Some of them, it's more cut and dry halacha sefer. In the Marshal, you could really get a sense for who the person was. Just go through a few pieces and you'll see pretty quickly. He was a very strong personality. He did not agree with the Beis Yosef's mahalach of we're going to make one Shulchan Aruch for the entire Klal Yisrael. He says
fiercely independent.
Yes, fiercely independent, exactly. And he said that every rav has to paskin every halacha as he sees fit. What kind of business is that there's one rav in Sfas who could decide the halacha for the entire Klal Yisrael? That's not the way it's supposed to work, right? Every rav has to paskin for themselves. So I personally am grateful that it seems like the majority of Klal Yisrael, accepted the Beis Yosef mahalach. But he also discusses this whether it's permitted to sit and to eat with Begila Rosh, or even to make a bracha. So he begins with as follows:
Is this in the Shut Marshal?
This is in Shut Marshal.
Okay.
Yeah, this is in Shut Marshal. He wrote Yam Shel Shlomo, which is a pirush on Masech on the Gemara, which also includes there's a lot of halacha which can be gleaned from there, and the Nosei Kalim are forever quoting from there. And he also wrote Shut Marshal, quite a responsa in the Marshal. So he begins as follows: I'm unaware of any prohibition to make a bracha without kisei rosh. And then he quotes the Trumas Adeshin that we just mentioned. Umarai, the Trumas Adeshin, Pasha lo she'asar b'askar Hashem, that you're not allowed to mention Hashem's name below kisei rosh. V'lo yidana mimai. I don't know where he's getting this prohibition from. Then there is a Rabbeinu Yerucham, who's also an authoritative Rishon, who says quite clearly she'asur levarach b'gila rosh, that it's forbidden to make a bracha b'gila rosh. V'lulei she'einei ragil lachal k'Rishonim. So Marshal says normally I wouldn't quickly argue on one of the kadmonim, one of the early Rishonim, unless I had somebody else backing me. But I personally would be more inclined to be lenient. It says even to read Kriya Shema would be permitted, and he actually quotes a fascinating medrash. Shar Isa medrash Rabbah. Amar Brachya Melech Basar Dam Mishagar Protegma Shalom Medina. So that he sends his how do you translate protegma, like his constitution, some type of like official document. So the king sends his document to the Medina. Maim Osin Kol Bnei Medina Omdim Al-Gam. They stand on their feet. Uparmas Roshayan V'Karnos Be'ema Yuris Avziyah. Avakotish Baruch Hu Amr Yisrael Kiru Kriya Shema Protegma Didi. So when you read Kriya Shema, which is my protegma, Harloid Shachli Lechem Likros Lo Omdim V'Lipur Rosh. So I wasn't matriach you to stand during Kriya Shema. I guess that's like Basil. V'Lipur Rosh. Mashma Lahedya Deleka is a Priyas Rosh. So he says Elish Lahichmer Le. So he sees clearly that there's no isser, there's no prohibition to read Kriya Shema with Priyas Rosh. So you see quite clearly, says the Marshal, we see from this medrash, there's no isser in reading Kriya Shema when one's head is uncovered. I've heard that Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, so it's always a question, what parts of the davening are you supposed to have your talus covering your head for? So it's a whole discussion but I heard that for Kriya Shema, the Soloveitchiks, they take it off because of this medrash, because this medrash is saying quite clearly that you don't have to. So I think for your shtabach and maybe even Sukkot Zimra, maybe they do wear it, but for Kriya Shema, I think brachas Kriya Shema and Kriya Shema, they take it off in light of this medrash that one is not obligated to wear. I wouldn't know because even though I learned to brisk, I wouldn't necessarily have seen them davening. Okay, maybe take that part out.
That's nice says, but the reason why is because it's a difference because it's limud Torah. Limud Torah does not require the extra.
No, they say the Reb Chaim did it because of this medrash.
Yeah, well, it's the medrash, but he said also because.
There's a mitzvah Kriya Shema.
Because it didn't limud Torah. Because limud Torah doesn't require.
Okay.
Doesn't require.
Perhaps maybe that's pshat the medrash.
If davening is a tifas arosh, but saying Torah doesn't require tifas arosh.
Okay, so then the Marshal continues, and maybe it's only midas chasidus. And then the Marshal. So this is where you see his personality come through. So he says, remember we mentioned that there's asur to mahalach b'komas kufa with an upright posture. So he says, now everybody walks around like this. So he says that these people, they walk around like this, and they're not they're not makbid on that, but everyone's makbid on yarmulkes. And he says that so he says, I'm gonna reveal this. I'm gonna spill the beans on the clothes, the disgrace of the Ashkenazim. So what happens? You have a guy who drinks yain nesach, which is wine that was handled by non-Jews in a non-Jewish hotel. And he violates dag mevushalim, cooked fish, which we mentioned in the shiur a couple of weeks ago. Right? But he says, but the guy who's machmer, he's machmer kashrus, and he makes sure he doesn't eat bishul akim. So he says it's backwards. We're living in a backwards world. He said the person who's being over on kashrus, and he's eating bishul akim and yain nesach. Oh, but he's wearing a yarmulke, so then he's fine. But then comes the guy who doesn't eat their food. He makes sure to bring his own food with him in the hotel, but he goes with gila rosh, which is not even a strict halacha. Then everybody said, well, you're going without a yarmulke. So the marshal exactly mam shegets. So tavzon kilo yatzim neklal. He's a heretic. He left the fold. So so make sure you don't get caught. So don't wear something heavy. So wear something light. But in any case, the Marshal, clearly is taking a different, has a different approach to this, and he's saying, where'd you all get this from? That there's a clear halacha, and why are people being more machmer in this than in strict halachas? Okay, so maybe just let's do there's a now we're going to cover a fascinating figure. This is like a favorite of all academics. Academics love talking about him. It was Rabbi Yehuda Arya di Modina. Rabbi Yehuda Arya of Modina. So who was he? He was born, I think, in Venice, and then he lived somewhere else, and then he moved back to Venice. Anyways, he was a fascinating person, absolutely brilliant. He wrote like endless svarim, and he was just a Renaissance man. He wrote songs and poetry and books. He was a bit infamous because he wrote some very controversial books, namely one of his svarim, which is against Kabbalah. He did not believe in Kabbalah, although the Chida, I think, does write that towards the end of his life, he himself had a story with a Gilgal, because one of his svarim also was, I think, against the concept of Gilgal, of reincarnation, and he wrote an entire sefer against this. I think the Chida writes that he himself was forced to admit when he himself, I forget the story exactly, but he encountered a clear evidence of a Gilgal, so he was ultimately modus, says the Chida. But the Chida also writes very sharply against him in general.
The Maharal was
the Maharal also talks about him?
Very, very...
Yeah.
Very, very harshly.
Well, we're going to see that he also caught the ire of some more recent poskim. So he has an entire tshuva about going without a yarmulke. In fact, he didn't wear a yarmulke. And there's a king, he wrote a Jewish philosophy for one of the kings. I think it was King James, and he asked him to, and they had it translated. And I think as part of his payment, he was supposed to take a portrait, and then something happened. The artist died in the middle or something like that. But it was a long story. To make a long story short, the picture of him was ultimately finished, and it's with him without a yarmulke. It was printed in one of his svarim. So you have a nice picture of this, very chashuv, nice beard and whatever. But only one problem: without wearing a yarmulke. Very, noticeably absent was his yarmulke. So he has an entire tshuva in his Shiloh Shuvas Ziknei Yehuda. That's what his Shiloh Shuvas are called. And it's a long shuvah. We're not going to do the whole thing, but basically he goes through all the Marmar Komas, all the sources that we're bringing, and he says very clearly that there's no isser in going without a yarmulke.
By the way, but it could be that the minhag in Italy was already like that. I'm not sure.
So no, it's not so clear because he says that
he was,
other rabbanim came out against him.
They did, but there could be that there were a lot of Italian.
It seems like the rabbanim came out of Chayim against him.
Yeah. For other things.
But he was definitely he wasn't afraid. He was a maverick. He wasn't afraid to go against the go into everybody else. So he would go without a yarmulke, and he writes an entire tshuva to back up his own hanhaga. So it's very interesting. If you look, there's a tshuva Tzitz Eliezer. Tzitz Eliezer was a Relez Yehuda Waldenberg. It was absolute gon olam. I read they put out a Rav. What's the name from the Encyclopedia Talmudis? Professor Steinberg. Right. So he did a compilation of all. He has a lot of very chashuv tshuvas on refuah, on all medical shilas. He was unbelievable in this. So he put together. I think there's 20 volumes, or 21 volumes of Tzitz Eliezer. So he kind of put together all the psukim in shorthand. It's very, very useful sefer. So in the Hakdam over there, so he quotes somebody, I think, who said it on a Rekiva Eger, who said that this person said, maybe I could write a tshuva like Rabbi Eger, but the one thing I can't write is, Rabbi Kiva will often write, Amish Kibalti, I received your shaila yesterday, V'hinini mehar l'kaisu, I'm writing it right away. Meaning, Rabbi Kiva didn't have to stop and think for 4 months, how he's going to respond, everything was on the spot. So the Tzitz Eliezer was the same way, he would get a shaila, and then boom, the next day, he was on the spot, he would just, whip out this, long tshuva. So, the Tzitz Eliezer has an entire tshuva regarding whether one is allowed to use non-Jewish music. It's said to use, undesirable types of songs for tefillah. Is a person allowed to do that? I remember one time when I was young, made a big rush, on Simchas Torah when they auction off all the different schusim. So one of them is who's going to daven musaf. So I think the teenage boys daven musaf, and I think they I don't remember what it was, but they used definitely some non-Jewish songs for Kedusha, and definitely a lot of people were rightfully upset. So he has an entire tshuva about this. Is it permitted to use these songs? So he quotes.
Does that include Maccabees?
I don't know. What do you mean? If it's their own songs, if they're singing a non-Jewish song, then I guess it was kasher once. It was like laundered. Song laundering.
You can't ban non-Jewish songs because so many of our popular Nigonim were non-Jewish.
So that's the whole thing. So the Rebbe say that the Rebbe Mekadesh it. Okay, but I think there's also a difference between what kind of song. There's songs and then there's songs. So he quotes over there at the end of the tshuva. To this Italian chacham, Rabbi Yehuda Armi Medina, and he's mishabeach. He praises the art of music. But then he goes on to say that this Rabbi Yehuda Armi Udina, he speaks badly about those who are against. So Rabbi Yehuda Ari was very, he was very musical, and he speaks badly about the Chazanim when they don't know how to sing and they're just, shrieking their heads off. So he says, don't take what he says seriously. Ulam endless bal mediber chacham talk. Don't get so nervous about you read in Shut Zikni Yehuda that how great this music is and it's so great to take non-Jewish songs and don't take any of these rabbis seriously. So the Eliezer said, don't take him seriously. It's not a pella. It's no wonder that he writes this. He was just like a confused person. He was just confused. So he's like he just fought against the rabbis. It wasn't just one person who viewed him as a kofar, as a heretic.
It was very cantankerous.
Right.
Very cantankerous.
And then he says, based on his own testimony, based on this his own testimony, which we just saw in his own tshuva, that he used to go without a yarmulke.
Moshe Shapiro used to speak very strongly against them.
Yeah. Then he says, he says when you have to take Chazal into context and the time and the place. And not only that, so he said you're going to call such a person a posek. Don't take his psak seriously. Like not everybody is magia l'chal hara that is worthy of taking his psak seriously. Log my osmer chazakad b'regel Shabbos. So apparently he laughs at the people who aser playing soccer on Shabbos. It's also known that he was a gambling addict.
And he had gambling.
Exactly. In his autobiography, he writes about his, and it caused him tsaris, and his wife got mad at him. He lost all his money. He had a very tragic life. But in any case, Sister Eliezer says, don't take that which he says so seriously because he wasn't exactly.
There's no connection between Shabbos and gambling.
What do you mean?
Was a gambler.
What do you mean there wasn't a connection between Shabbos and gambling? What do you mean by that?
Well, there's no connection, right? So you didn't break Shabbos to gamble. That was just another point.
Right, but the Tzitz are just saying the whole person was like a very, Right.
No, but he had a gambling addiction.
Yeah, he had addiction. Yeah, he said he couldn't. He tried stopping himself and he swore it off for 6 months. And really, if you read his biography, I once read it.
He was a genius. He was an elite, but he was not a chacham.
But some of his things actually were accepted. So the very first pisman that we say for Yom Kippur Katan is from him. There's a lot of his songs. He was a beautiful poet, and he wrote beautiful things. So the first pisman, if you look for Yom Kippur Katan, comes from him.
The conservative rabbis used to quote him all the time.
Yeah, I'm sure he's a favorite of theirs. They quote who they want to quote, right?
But yeah.
Okay, so let's just try to wrap up.
There's no such thing as a conservative rabbi. They're not rabbis.
It's true. Moshe, whenever he talks about conservative rabbis, he always writes in Rabbi, Reish Aleph, Beis Yud Yud, quote unquote, Rab. No, but that's it. And Moshe is very clear from his Shuvas.
Rabbi, he wrote in Yiddish.
I thought it was a Reish Aleph. I have to look again.
Yeah, I think it's Reish.
Okay, either way, but very clear. But it's also very clear from Moshe's Shuvas that the whole Isser is to show, to give them any legitimacy. So you can't do a joint thing if it's gonna grant them an Orthodox rabbi and a conservative rabbi together. That we can't do. Okay. All right, so now we're going to move on to. All right, so the kolbo. The kolbo is also a Rishon. And he says as follows: that a person not to daven with his head uncovered, or with his feet barefoot. Unless, so he says, unless a person would normally go like this in front of a respectable person. Because of Ram that there's no isser to go with the head uncovered, because it only means chasidus. And then he quotes Rabbeinu Peretz who says, but to go into a shul, it's for usher to go without gila rosh. So he says that be'etzem it's only means chasidus, but to walk into shul, that's for sure usher. Rabbeinu Yerucham, so we mentioned Rabbeinu Yerucham says, I think we mentioned this before, that it's usher to make berachas hamazon or any bracha b'gila rosh. So he said that's for sure usher. And how does the Shulchan Aruch paskin? So the Shulchan Aruch says yesh omer sha'asur l'hotzi askar mepim mirosh megula. So he quotes Rabbi Yerucham and says that yesh omrim. There are those who say that it's usher to mention the name of Hashem of the rosh megula. Yesh omrim sheishlimcha shalikanas beis b'knesset b'gila rosh. And there are those who say that you're not allowed to enter a shul begila rosh. They seem to go with both these halachas. A person not allowed to make a bracha begila rosh, and one's not allowed to enter into a shul. However, the Gra says that the Gra seems to say that no, really, there's no isser to go begila rosh, but sorry, 1 second. So the Gra argues, and he says, really, even to mention the name of Hashem is only midas chasidus. The Gemara brachas lemashmakei. Right, he quotes this measure also the lo trachti lechem, that wasn't matriach you to cover your hair, which that's during Shema. During Shema, there's obviously the Shem of Hashem. So the Gemara says you see from that measure that a person technically is allowed to go. So the Gemara says that strictly speaking, there's never isser, but only b'fnei gdolim be'esat tefillah, then it's menachem mitzad musar. It's like the right thing to do. That's the right thing to do. But as well as kedoshim, meaning if a person's on a higher level, a higher stature, so it's expected of him, so then he has to wear yarmulke. But the Gra is clearly positing that me'ikar din, there's never an isser, and it's only a question of when is the right thing to do. So he says that fnei gdolim during tefillah, and for people of certain stature, they should go with a yarmulke. Okay. So now let's just move on to halacha l'maisa. So what about, everyone wants to know about the black hat. Where does black hat come from? So the Mishabura in Siman Tzadi Aleph says that it was manenu tzarich lahasan be'ezat tefillah kova b'rosho, that a person has to wear a hat, keder sheholich berchov, v'lo b'kova katan shetachas kova, that a person should not just wear his yarmulke, ki ein derech lama kein lefnei anashim chashuvim. So the Mishabura says that it's not the derech to go like that in front of respectable people. Then he also goes on to say that a person should not wear gloves, or person should not wear gloves, and I think boots also, because that's also, meaning the bottom line is anything that a person wouldn't, if a person was meeting the president or the king, he wouldn't stand before him like that. So kolshkin l'fnei, melech malachim lachim, they should not stand it. Now, a lot of people, I think there is a source to this. People think that the hat is about the double covering, right? And there are sources to the idea that the reason why we wear a hat is to wear two coverings. But me'ikra din, the real reason, if there's a chiv to wear the hat, it would be based on this. It's about proper attire before a king, and since it was the proper attire to stand before a king, so then with a hat, so therefore when a person is davening, they would have to do that as well. So the argument today is that nowadays, when people go to meet the president, they don't wear a hat. So it does seem like a logical argument that one is not strictly not obligated. So different minhagim, whether or not one is obligated to wear a hat.
In yeshivas, they always talk about also the sudra of Talmidei Chachamim. That there was also to wear larger headgear for Talmidei Chachamim. They wore like a turban, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people quote that as a source also.
Right.
That's why you have the Iligim Shalmela, just like in the times of the Amoraim, they wore a sudra, that type of thing. And also all Sephardi Chachamim wore that. The Ashkenazi wore also headgear from that standpoint. They never wore without a hat.
Yeah.
And also, strictly speaking, the shpura would apply for any time you say any bracha, because you're talking to God. You're standing.
So we say, would that apply to bracha as well? Unless it's in tefillah. Tefillah is a higher level. As I was speaking about on Shabbos. Tefillah is Lefnei Hashem.
I see.
Tefillah is Lefnei Hashem.
Anytime you say Baruch Atah Hashem, aren't you addressing Hashem directly?
Does it have the same mila of Lefnei Hashem? I'm not sure. I don't think so.
Salvation was very, very makpid to bench. See, in the cafeteria was always makpid to bench with a hat.
Right.
The hat for benching, but it wasn't makpid for a bracha rishona. Tea and a coffee. I used to make bracha without a hat. But
right.
For benching.
So benching is also another.
And for davening, benching
right.
for davening, fits for davening, and for benching, but not
yeah.
for bracha rishona.
Okay. So I'll just end off with perhaps a little bias over here.
Specifically for tefillah, then are you allowed to wear it outside tefillah?
You mean, would that diminish? No, I don't think it would diminish. No, on the contrary. It's not that it has to be something special for tefillah, although there is an idea of that. But it's about tefillah can't be any less. Meaning, if a person would stand before other chashuv people, then Hashem can't be any less. So therefore, however a person would go, whoever who's the most respectable person, I don't know. Let's say I don't get political here. A person would go meet Trump, right? So what would he wear when you meet Trump or meet the governor?
And the yarmulke, and
Exactly.
The yarmulke, and the black yarmulke. I won't accept anything.
Exactly. It doesn't want any.
When we went
But I'm
to
saying,
governor, we
right.
we were, I
So whatever a person would wear. So then it's like okay. So it's up for I remember when. I think when Trump came to the Kotel, so I was just laughing because there's like he met a few rabbis. So there's Rabinowitz and there's another Rav Kotel, like more Mizrahi. But he's wearing his sandals like barefoot and just wearing as regular like he wasn't a spall from Trump or anything. So okay, so so for him he's not obligated because it is somewhat societal. And the last thing halacha is regarding a gartel. So there is the Torah does bring down, and they're based on Gemara and Shabbos, but the Torah does bring down because of al truma kan yishlim should tzarich adam lazer ezer b'shas tefillah has person to wear a belt during tefillah. Afilu yesh la'abnei she'ein leberes erva. So it's not only to prevent liberos erva, right? As we saw before with the Reina Taam, one consideration is to make sure that there's something in between the leiv and the erva. But the Baal Truma says no. Even if that's not an issue, a person has to wear something special for tefillah. And says the Beis Yosef, the kasar ben Yerucham sheyesh mishkas shemisha ragal lachar kol hayom im hitar chagaraza come to tefillah tzarich lachzar lachar. That somebody who wears a belt the whole day, so if he takes it off before davening, then he has to put it back on. Misha halach kol hayom l'chagura ain't tzarich lachar tefillah. So he says no, it's only if a person is makbet to wear it the whole day, right? And then he takes it off before davening, then he would be obligated to put it back on. But somebody who doesn't wear a belt is not obligated to put one on. However, the Shulchan Aruch says, like the Baal Truma, tzarich laser ezer b'shas tefillah, that a person does have to wear a belt b'shas tefillah. Afilu yesh la'avnei she'ein leberes erva. So even if there's already something blocking between his leiv and erva, b'shem hichun, because there's another concept of in tefillah when it comes to hichun l'krasa l'kaf yisrael. The person has to do extra acts to prepare himself to daven. Like I mentioned before, so there are certain aspects of tefillah that it can't be any less than, and then there's also obviously we have to do more, before we daven b'fnei melech malachim lachim. Al shar brachos mutar levar b'lecha gur me'ach sheish b'chnasayim. He says this is only for tefillah. But other brachos that so here he makes a clear distinction between tefillah and other brachos with regard to the ezer, to the belt. So this is the makar for Chasidim. So I think the kasha is on why the people who are not makbid, why are they not makbid? Okay.
They say you're with your belt in your pants, the elastic in your underwear. That's
how you're to tefillah.
I'm wearing a gartel. It's in my underwear.
Okay.
Baal Shem Tov and the message.
Yes, that's they took it very seriously. Yeah, of course.
Very, very, very.
Okay, thank you everyone.
Can I still have a question?
Sure.